Anna, you got a few minutes?
Yes?
Good. Sit with me a spell, and I'll tell you some things about our family's roots that might interest you.
Righteous.
I know you've heard some of the stories. We've talked about this before, and I'm aware you've heard things from your mother and dad and Grammy and Granddad Stein. But there are parts of my family's story that you would not have been able to understand when you were younger. And I'd like to tell them to you now.
Is it something bad?
I'm afraid so, Anna. It involves crimes against humanity, but our family were innocent victims, not perpetrators.
Does it involve the Unity?
Yes. How'd you know? Was that an educated guess?
Well, you said crimes against humanity, and I thought of them. And Granny told me that your parents were living at that time.
That's right. In any case, our family's involvement goes back to your great-great-grandparents, James and Linnell.
Your father's parents?
Right. In 3017, James, Linnell, and their 4-year-old son Glyn, my father, fled New York and exiled themselves to an underground sanctuary called the Subterra. Around 1,000 people lived there, with a heavy concentration of writers, artists, scientists, scholars, and political dissidents. All of them were fleeing the Unity's oppression.
Okay, go on.
Okay. This chapter in the Gallagher family history begins in 2009-96, the year the anti-weapon was first used. As you know, within a few years, humans had eradicated violence from the face of the planet.
I don't know how people lived before the anti-weapon. I mean, I can't even imagine it.
I can well understand. We take it for granted. But imagine how overjoyed James and Linnell's generation must have felt. In less than a decade, a great curse that had blighted the earth for millennia was lifted. With the specter of violence gone, people believed they would be embarking on a new era of peace and prosperity, in which the world's problems would be justly and efficiently solved.
Wow. How did they go from that to electing the Unisons?
Well, the decades before the Unity came to power were a horror show. Governments, religions, universities, the media, they had all become corrupt or perverted. People were driven to nihilistic despair. In 3016, the Unisons gained power and found a more effective way to control the masses than with the threat of violence. They discovered that if you could completely usurp language and images, then you could control thought without having to resort to violence, because you would be altering the nature of reality itself. Where were we? Oh, right. The Unity's deceptions. It lied and deceived on such an enormous scale that it nearly blacked out recorded history. The relentless psychic assault of all that lying and manipulation wore people down, and eventually they gave up on critical thinking, emotional depth, and the search for objective truths. They clung to the only thing left of them: the blinkered, synthetic tranquility of the technologically obsessed world.
So the Unisons controlled people with just lies.
They had powerful tools that reinforced and amplified it all: mind-numbing drugs, brainwashing media, and legions of useful idiots among the populace who spread the regime's propaganda day in and day out. This was no kind of a life. Linnell once told Juna that before she and James moved to the Subterra, a household droid once tried to sell her an app for managing earwax removal. She shut the infernal thing off and did her own chores for a week, but not before leaving its makers an InstaChat message informing them that they needed to look for meaningful employment to liberate them from the pathetically spineless job of bamboozling people. This was a culture that shunned novels, short stories, plays, and poetry. on the grounds that they were illogical and hazardous to mental health. Under the circumstances, what could you expect beyond a society of nitwits?
Why didn't people rebel?
Another good question, Anna. Now, here's where it gets complicated, so listen carefully. The truth is, some aspects of life under unison rule were actually good. All unisons, including the poorest, lived in decent housing. Luxurious if you were a member of the moneyed classes. Everyone had guaranteed health care and a guaranteed annual income, whether you worked or not. Violent crime was virtually non-existent, thwarted in all its various forms by anti-weapons in all their various forms.
I don't get it. I mean, it sounds like a utopia.
It might have been, were it not for the darkness beneath the surface. You had to relinquish all that distinguishes human beings from machines. Your great-grandfather once told me that he sometimes encountered droids who displayed more brains, heart, and common sense than humans.
Didn't that alarm people? I mean, how could they not know something was terribly wrong?
Well, by the time these problems developed, people were just too far gone. They were hopelessly complacent. If you displayed any sign of emerging consciousness, if you were a hard case, you would be sent to a hospice home for re-blissing. No secret police would come for you. It was your friends or family who would intervene.
That's hideous.
You bet. Now you know why James and Linnell had to flee.
Did they have to start over? Did they take anything with them?
Yes, they did start over. They left home with nothing but the clothes on their back, some extra items in backpacks, a couple of micro drives, and a few pocket-sized valuables and heirlooms. They started out knowing no one in the Subterra.
How did people survive in the Subterra? Were they hunted by the Unisons?
They managed all right, all things considered. Part of it was that they were hiding in plain sight, which actually worked to their advantage. There was no escaping the regime's relentless scrutiny. It surveilled everyone and everything, everywhere and all the time, and could easily find and destroy anything that threatened its existence. In fact, it was the Unity's absolute power that made it unnecessary for the regime to come after the exiles, who were generally regarded by the populace as harmless crackpots.
So how did the country get freed from the Unity?
In 3026, something unimaginable occurred. The Unity began to transform itself. The long and the short of it is, it took half a century, but the state evolved into a culture that encouraged enlightened intellectual and artistic ideas.
How did it happen?
In the absence of reliable facts, we can only speculate. The leading theory right now is that the regime was undermined by a dangerous emotion that it hadn't anticipated.
What was it?
Believe it or not, it was boredom. However impossible it may seem to fathom, a curious restlessness and a restless curiosity quietly bloomed in the hearts and minds of Unisons, and was soon felt in the streets, bedrooms, and halls of power.
That's incredible.
We know that eventually even the Unity's stone-cold leadership began to bridle at the dull rhythms of machine-like existence, which had begun to breed disquiet and dissent in the ranks. The Unity had thrived on the cheap novelty of mediocrity, but now something stirred in people that made them crave deeper, more visionary ideas and creations. The wealthy and powerful became patrons and supporters of the arts, humanities, and advanced scientific research. And these things helped spark a resurgent interest in democracy. Very powerful and influential people came calling in the Subterra, looking for exiles they'd heard about, aiming to find out what, if anything, they might discover about the human mind and spirit. That's how the Rebirth began.
How could people let mass insanity happen? And could it happen again? I mean, yeah, it ended well for us, but it's really scary. What if the human race doesn't recover from the next breakdown?
The short answer to the first question is that history is long and memory is short. Generations pass and people forget the lessons. So yes, my dear, it could happen again. As a matter of fact, it will eventually fall to your generation to see that it doesn't. But the important thing now is just for you to know the history. You can just live your life, and the more living you do, the more you'll understand what needs to be done to help the world stay sane. You're already a helper, kiddo. Just stay the course.
Thanks, Granddaddy.
You bet. I think I'll mix a couple of cocktails for your Grammy and me. Care for a fizz?
Yes, thanks. Is there any black raspberry left?